All right, so we are now going to look at programming exercise 6.6, display patterns. And so with display patterns, we want to write a method that has an integer parameter n. So it takes one single integer in as a parameter, and then it displays the following pattern. So on the first row, we write justify the number 1. On the second row, we display the number 2 and then the number 1. Again, write justified. On the third row, the number 3, the number 2, the number 1. Write justified all the way down to that integer, that last row, that nth row, if you will. We start by displaying n, then n minus 1, and then all the way 4, 3, 2, 1 down to 1. And again, write justified. And then we're going to have to write a driver program, a test program that's going to prompt the user to enter that integer and invoke this method that we're going to call display pattern. And that's going to display the pattern above. So we know that our driver program, or our test program, if you will, occurs in our main method, and the user defined method display pattern, we're going to have that below the main method, outside of the main method, but still within the class. So since we're going to have some user input, we're going to need our scanner. So we'll import the scanner on line 13. And then in our main method, we're going to instantiate a scanner object. So we declare Jeeves. We're going to prompt the user to enter an integer, that integer n, so we know how many rows that we want to display. And I'm going to read that into a variable, an integer variable that I call numRows. And then right here, I'm going to go ahead and close. So let's go ahead and close the scanner. And then I want to call this method that I need to write display pattern. And display pattern is going to take as its input one integer, and that integer is going to be the number of rows that we need to display that pattern for. And so outside of the main method, but still within the class, we're going to have our method called display pattern. So public static void, this is a void method. It doesn't have a return value. It's not going to return anything. So there'll be no return statement in this particular method. It's only going to print something out. And so oftentimes you'll find when the only purpose of a method is to print something out, then that method returns void, which means it doesn't return anything. And we have as an integer parameter some value n. So we want to print each row. And to print each row, we need to do two things. A row is going to be comprised, remember, of some number of spaces, and then those numbers printed backwards. And so in order to print the entire row, we're going to print row 1, and then row 2, and then row 3. And so that's going to require a for loop to do that. So we'll start our for loop at row equal 1, and we'll continue printing each row from row 1 to row n. So as long as row is less than or equal to n, we're going to continue looping because we have more rows to print. And we want to increment row, our loop counter variable, by 1. So again, the first thing that we do in printing a row is print the spaces. And in order to do that, we have to print some number of spaces. And how many spaces do we print? Well, we print n minus 1 spaces, or n minus 2 spaces for the second row, or n minus 3 spaces for the third row. So n minus the number of the row spaces is how many we print. So if we start counting at whatever that row number is, and we continue printing spaces as long as I, our loop control variable for this inner for loop, as long as I is less than or equal to n, that's going to give us n minus 1, or I'm sorry, n minus row iterations. So when row is 1, it would be n minus 1. When row is 2, we'll print out n minus 2 spaces, etc. And so again, the only thing this for loop serves to do is print out the appropriate number of spaces. Once the correct number of spaces are printed out, now we have to print out those numbers. And remember, we want to start printing the numbers at whatever number row we're on. So if we're on row 1, we only want to print 1. If we're on row 2, we want to print the number 2, followed by the number 1. And so here, we're able to reuse this I as our control variable, because remember, for scoping, the variables that are declared in this for loop, in those parentheses right there, the scope of that variable is only the body of the for loop. So when the for loop that we began on line 31 ends in line 33, the variable I goes away. It's out of scope. It's no longer accessible. So we're able to reuse that name. So we can reuse the name I as a control variable in line 36. So a completely separate space is allocated and given the name I for this for loop between lines 36 and 38. So we start looping on I, and we start counting at row, because the first number that we want to print is the number of that row. After we've printed the spaces, now we're printing the number, and we want to start printing numbers as the number of that row. And we want to print the numbers all the way down to 1. So as long as I is less than or equal to 1, we want to keep printing the numbers, and we're going to print the numbers backwards. So we need to decrement. So I minus minus, we decrement and not increment. And again, we're going to have our print statement, and we print out I. Again, a print statement, not a print line statement, because we're still printing all of this code from line 30 to line 38 prints a single line. Once we finish printing those numbers backwards to 1, now we're ready to go to the next line. So we insert the print line statement you see on line 40, and that moves our cursor to the next line. And that is the end of the for loop from line 29 to 41, which prints out a single line in that pattern, or which prints out, I'm sorry, the entire pattern, one line at a time, one row at a time. And that is the end of our method display pattern. Remember, display pattern, we place our user-defined methods after the end of the main method, but before we end the class. They must still be in the class. And here's the end of our class PE0606. All right, so let's go ahead and run this and demonstrate that it works. So I'm going to enter an integer. I'm going to enter the integer 3. And there we have it. Let's run it again with a larger integer. Enter an integer. Let's enter 6 this time. And there we have it. So important things to note here is that this method returns void. So that's the return value type. It takes in a single parameter of type integer. Because it returns void, there's no return statement. We've got some nesting of our for loops. So we have for loops nested inside of another for loop. We're using a decrement on one of our for loops. And once we finish printing out a single row, then we have to use a print line statement in order to move the cursor to the next line. And once again, our methods always begin with a lowercase letter and use camel case. All right, so that's programming exercise 6.6.